On the night of March the 22nd, 2026, something extraordinary happened in the skies above the Baltic Sea. It didn't happen with a single dramatic flash. It didn't produce a headline that captured the full weight of what it meant. It happened in the form of drone after drone after drone crossing Russian airspace at low altitude, navigating around radar coverage, threading through gaps in Russia's air defense network, gaps that Ukraine had spent the previous 9 months methodically carving open, and converging on two ports that together handled nearly half of all Russian oil shipped to the world market: Primorsk, UST Luga, the twin spigots of the Russian war economy. At Primorsk, satellite imagery released the following morning showed smoke rising from at least 5 of 18 storage tanks in the terminal complex. The fire burned for days. At Ust-Luga, a strike hit the Novatek terminal, Russia's second-largest natural gas producer, sparking a blaze at the gas condensate processing facility and halting export operations entirely. Russian flight tracking data showed that loading operations at both ports, which together exported an average of 40 to 50 tankers per week, collapsed. By the end of that week, Finnish maritime officials monitoring Baltic traffic reported shipments down to individual vessels. 50 tankers were anchored in the Gulf of Finland, waiting offshore for ports that could not receive them. Bloomberg calculated the damage from that single week. Russia's total oil exports fell 43%, from 407 million barrels per day to 2.32 million barrels per day. The lost revenue, based on prevailing Urals, crude prices, was approximately $1 billion in 7 days, from drone strikes, whose total cost was a fraction of that figure. And then Ukraine struck again. Here is the thing that makes what Ukraine has unleashed in the first months of 2026 different from every previous phase of this war's economic dimension. It is not a campaign. It is not a series of raids. It is a firestorm, a self-reinforcing, systematically expanding, deliberately relentless assault on the single mechanism that keeps Russia's war machine funded, fueled, and operational. And unlike the fires that Ukraine has set at Russian refineries and ports and oil terminals in previous years, this one is burning faster than Russia can put it out. The numbers alone tell a story that should stop everyone paying attention to this war. Reuters reported in late March 2026 that Ukrainian attacks on port infrastructure, combined with the halt of oil flows along the Druzhba pipeline and the seizure of Russia-linked tankers, had disrupted approximately 40% of Russia's oil export capacity. Roughly 2 million barrels per day. 2 million barrels per day? The most severe oil supply disruption in the modern history of Russia, which is the world's second-largest oil exporter. Reuters did not call it a significant disruption. Reuters called it the worst in modern Russian history. Separately, Reuters calculated that Ukrainian strikes on refineries had cut Russian refining capacity by approximately 17%, around 1.1 million barrels per day of processing capacity that was no longer processing. Ukraine's drone commanders reported that the strikes were costing Russia roughly $100 million per day in lost oil revenue per day. Oil and gas exports account for nearly 25% of the Russian state budget. The money that buys the Iskander missiles fired into Ukrainian apartment buildings. The money that funds the Shahed drone factories supplying the nightly bombardments. The money that pays the soldiers, replaces the destroyed equipment, sustains the logistical tale of the largest ground war in Europe in 80 years. Ukraine is not trying to inconvenience Russia's energy sector. Ukraine is trying to set fire to Russia's war chest. And in the spring of 2026, for the first time in 4 years of trying, it is succeeding at a scale and a sustained pace that is genuinely new. To understand why 2026 is different from every previous year of Ukrainian strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, you have to understand two things that changed simultaneously, and that, in combination, produced something neither side could have predicted in isolation. The first thing that changed was production volume. In March 2026, Ukraine deployed over 7,000 long-range drones in a single month, 7,000. And for the first time since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022, Ukraine launched more attack drones than Russia in a calendar month. 7,347 Ukrainian drones compared to 6,162 Russian. That crossing of the production threshold deserves to be read slowly. Russia invaded Ukraine with the largest military in Europe. Russia had the industrial base, the defense factories, the decades of stockpiled munitions, the workforce, the resources. Ukraine was fighting for survival with whatever it could scrape together. And in March 2026, Ukraine outproduced Russia in long-range attack drones for the first month in the entire war. President Zelensky, who had confirmed in January 2026 that Ukraine was now producing 2,000 interceptor drones per day and had offered half of them to Gulf states, described the trajectory in a single sentence. Today, our deep strikes are no longer a sensation, not a revelation, not a breakthrough, routine. The second thing that changed was tactics. The Atlantic Council's analysis, published in April 2026, identified something that the raw numbers obscure. Ukraine's most recent wave of attacks has not just grown in scale. It has grown in intelligence. The campaign that leveled Baltic port infrastructure in late March 2026 was not a series of independent raids. It was a coordinated sequence of repeat strikes on the same high-value targets, carefully timed to prevent repair crews from restoring operations before the next wave arrived. The Tuapse refinery on the Black Sea was struck on April 16, 2026, sparking a fire that required more than 150 firefighters and emergency personnel and burned for days. Ukraine struck it again on April 20th. 4 days later, before the fire from the first strike had been fully extinguished. The U.S. Deluga terminal was struck, began attempting to resume operations, and was struck again on April 5th, the very same night that the first tanker in days attempted to dock and load crude. Ukraine hit the port again as the tanker sat in the loading lane. The tanker left. 3 20,000 cubic meter storage tanks caught fire. That targeting logic, watch for the repair, strike before the recovery, force the cumulative damage to compound, represents a strategic sophistication that is categorically different from the opportunistic raid mentality that characterized earlier phases of Ukraine's deep strike campaign. Ukraine is no longer just hitting Russia's oil infrastructure, it is managing a sustained siege of it. Now look at the geographic scope of what Ukraine has already struck, because the map of targets is a map of a systematic campaign that has been working through Russia's energy architecture from north to south, from export terminal to refinery to pipeline to chemical plant to the very mechanisms by which oil moves from Russian oil fields to the tankers that carry it to markets that fund the war. In the Baltic, Ust-Luga. Hit repeatedly, operation suspended, handling what Finnish maritime officials described as individual vessels, instead of the normal 40 to 50 per week. Primorsk, satellite imagery showed 40% of its storage facilities damaged, loading suspended for days at a stretch. The Kirishneftyorg's Intez oil refinery in Kurishi, Leningrad Oblast, struck twice in consecutive nights in late March. Processing capacity for 350,000 barrels per day disrupted. Its main processing unit previously shut down in an October 2025 attack, now hit again as it attempted to recover. The Novatek LNG terminal at Ust-Luga, struck March 25th, gas condensate exports suspended. In the Black Sea, Tuapse, Rosneft's Black Sea export refinery, processing 240,000 barrels per day, struck April 16th and again April 20th. Operation suspended, a man-made disaster unfolding in the city, according to Russian independent monitoring channels, with reports that roads near the facility had become covered in oil products. A Ukrainian telegram channel mordantly noting that, finally, an oil and gas country is sharing oil with its people instead of sponsoring a war with it. Novorossiysk, the Shishkari's oil terminal, struck on April 5th. Pipeline of a single mooring point damaged, loading terminal damaged, 4 oil product storage tanks set ablaze. The Caspian Pipeline Consortium terminal also struck, handling 1.5% of global oil supply, pipeline, and loading infrastructure damaged. Shareholders of the CPC include Chevron and ExxonMobil. Ukraine struck a facility in which American oil majors hold equity stakes in the industrial heartland. Samara Oblast, the Novokuybishevsk refinery, processing 8.8 million tons annually, struck April 18th. Primary oil processing unit halted. The Syzran refinery, also Samara Oblast, struck hours later. Fire reported at crude oil and petroleum product storage. The Saratov refinery struck. The Bashneft Ufaneftekhim refinery in Bashkortostan struck. One of the largest distillation units shut down. The Volgograd refinery, its primary distillation unit, accounting for 40% of total capacity, taken out of service in a February 11th strike. The Yaroslavl refinery near Moscow, the Norsy refinery in Nizhny Novgorod, Russia's 4th largest, struck April 5th. The Ilsky refinery in Krasnodar, critical to fuel logistics for Russian forces in southern Ukraine. 2 drilling platforms in the Caspian Sea, 2 oil pumping stations, the Kurepovets Azot ammonia plant, the Sterlitamak petrochemical plant, railway infrastructure, military logistics nodes. In January and February 2026 alone, Ukraine conducted 40 attacks on Russian oil facilities, striking 13 major targets. In March, that campaign reached what independent defense analysts at Missile Matters described as a new peak, with cumulative damage appearing, for the first time, to be outpacing Russia's capacity to repair and replace it. That phrase, outpacing Russia's capacity to repair, carries consequences that go beyond the oil facilities themselves. Because Russia has a war to fight, and that war requires fuel. It requires diesel for tanks and armored vehicles. It requires aviation fuel for the warplanes dropping glide bombs on Ukrainian cities. It requires fuel for the logistics trucks moving ammunition to the front. It requires the industrial inputs, chemical feedstocks, solvents, lubricants that flow from the petrochemical plants Ukraine is systematically dismantling. The Ilsky refinery in Krasnodar wasn't on Ukraine's target list because it's a large facility. It was on the target list because it's the primary fuel supplier for Russian military logistics in southern Russia, the logistical spine feeding Russian forces operating in the direction of Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. The Volgograd refinery isn't strategically interesting because of its name. It's strategically interesting because the area it serves encompasses the rail and road networks funneling supplies toward the Eastern Front. Ukraine is not burning oil facilities as symbols. It is burning the fuel supply chain of an army that burns 500,000 liters of fuel per day in active operations. And there is an additional dimension to the campaign's timing that the Kremlin cannot have failed to notice, and that Ukraine planned with cold strategic intelligence. When the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury against Iran on February 28, 2026, the immediate geopolitical consequence for Moscow was a windfall. Global Brent crude prices surged from $70.71 per barrel on February 27th to $108.01 on March 26th, a 53% increase in less than a month. Russia, already struggling with oil and gas revenues that had plummeted 47% in the first 2 months of 2026 under mounting sanctions pressure and defense spending that had consumed an estimated 30% of the federal budget, was staring at a lifeline. The Iran war had handed Vladimir Putin the oil price spike that his war economy desperately needed. Ukraine saw it too, and Ukraine's response was immediate, targeted, and devastating. It began destroying the ports and terminals through which Russia had to export the oil that was now worth $50 more per barrel. The price of Russian oil went up. The volume Russia could export went down. The Kremlin's windfall calculation was intercepted in midair and shredded. The Atlantic Council put it plainly: Ukraine's strikes seemed designed to prevent the Kremlin from refilling its war chest at precisely the moment the Iran war had created the conditions to do so. The strategic timing was not coincidental. It was a direct countermove. Now here's the question that every analyst paying serious attention to this campaign is asking, and whose answer Russia finds most uncomfortable. How is Ukraine doing it? The answer lies in two processes that have been operating in parallel for 18 months, and that the spring of 2026 has proven were sufficient to reach critical mass simultaneously. We're watching oil rain down on their streets. The Telegram channel Exilanova Plus published the observation with a sentence that was simultaneously sardonic and devastating. An oil and gas country was finally sharing its oil with its people, instead of sponsoring a war with it. That sentence landed in Russian social media and spread, because it contained the truth that the Kremlin's information architecture has spent 4 years suppressing, that the oil wealth of Russia, the petroleum that should theoretically have made every Russian citizen materially comfortable, has instead been consumed by a war that is now burning the infrastructure through which that oil flows, in Russian cities, on Russian streets, in view of Russian citizens who were promised that this war would be short, victorious, and consequence-free. The consequences are arriving, not in the form of a decisive battlefield reversal, not as a single dramatic moment of collapse. They are arriving as fires that take days to extinguish and resume burning before the embers are fully cold, as tankers sitting idle in the Gulf of Finland with nowhere to dock, as a refinery in Bashkortostan that has halted its largest distillation unit, as a Caspian pipeline consortium shared by Chevron and ExxonMobil that has pipeline and loading infrastructure burning on the Russian Black Sea coast, as an oil revenue figure that fell 47% in the first 2 months of 2026, even before the drone campaign reached its current peak, as a war budget that requires $96 oil just to break even on current spending and receives instead disrupted exports, repaired infrastructure that is restruck before it resumes operations, and drone production lines that distribute and multiply faster than the air defense units being deployed to stop them. Ukraine's weapon for this phase of the war is not a single missile or a single drone. It is a firestorm, a burning that moves across Russia's energy architecture the way a real fire moves across dry terrain, jumping between targets, resisting containment, finding the gaps in every defensive line. And the fires in Tuapse, in Primorsk, at Ust-Luga, in Novorossiysk, at Volgograd, at Kirishi, those are not separate events. They are one fire, one campaign, one sustained, methodical, relentlessly expanding application of Ukraine's most sophisticated strategic insight, that the way to make an army too expensive to sustain is to burn the treasury that funds it, not just the soldiers that fight it. Russia cannot put this out, not because Ukraine's drones are individually unbeatable, but because there are more of them than Russia's depleted air defense can reliably stop. Because Ukraine has spent 18 months punching holes in Russia's radar coverage and is now read that statement with the clarity it requires. Russia is watching its primary war financing mechanism burn, Russia is watching 40% of its oil export capacity go offline. Russia is watching the Iran war oil price windfall it desperately needed get siphoned away by Ukrainian drones before the tankers can leave port. Russia is watching the Tuapse refinery that supplies its southern military logistics halt operations for the first time in years. Russia cannot stop it. Not because it lacks desire. Because its air defense network is too overstretched. Its repair capacity is being outpaced. Its improvised solutions are being photographed and published by its own critics as evidence of desperation. And the country doing the burning is producing drones faster than Russia can intercept them. And so Russia threatens Europe, because threatening Ukraine with more bombardment is no longer a deterrent. Ukraine is already experiencing the maximum bombardment Russia can sustain. Because threatening consequences against Ukrainian drone operators is no longer credible when Ukraine is outproducing Russia in the category of weapons Russia used to dominate. And because the only lever Russia has left in this specific fight is the one it has used most consistently throughout the war. The threat that expanding the conflict to include Europe's industrial support would produce escalation too costly for European governments to accept. Europe has not blinked. The agreements with Ukrainian drone companies have proceeded. The production partnerships have deepened. Germany's government has classified airlines used in Russian logistics as sanctioned entities. European intelligence services are sharing targeting data. The support structure for Ukraine's drone campaign is not retreating. It is accelerating. There is a detail from the Tuapse situation that captures the full picture of what this firestorm means better than any statistic. After the April 16th strike set the refinery ablaze and more than 150 emergency personnel spent days fighting the fire, Russian monitoring channels reported that roads near the facility had begun to be covered in a layer of oil products. Residents of Tuapse, a Russian city on the Black Sea coast, far from the front lines, a city whose residents have been told for 4 years that their country is engaged in a special military operation to denazify a neighboring country, were watching oil rain down on their streets. The Telegram channel Exilanova Plus published the observation with a sentence that was simultaneously sardonic and devastating. An oil and gas country was finally sharing its oil with its people, instead of sponsoring a war with it. That sentence landed in Russian social media and spread, because it contained the truth that the Kremlin's information architecture has spent 4 years suppressing, that the oil wealth of Russia, the petroleum that should theoretically have made every Russian citizen materially comfortable, has instead been consumed by a war that is now burning the infrastructure through which that oil flows in Russian cities, on Russian streets, in view of Russian citizens who were promised that this war would be short, victorious, and consequence-free. The consequences are arriving, not in the form of a decisive battlefield reversal, not as a single dramatic moment of collapse. They are arriving as fires that take days to extinguish and resume burning before the embers are fully cold, as tankers sitting idle in the Gulf of Finland with nowhere to dock, as a refinery in Bashkortostan that has halted its largest distillation unit, as a Caspian pipeline consortium shared by Chevron and ExxonMobil that has pipeline and loading infrastructure burning on the Russian Black Sea coast, as an oil revenue figure that fell 47% in the first 2 months of 2026, even before the drone campaign reached its current peak, as a war budget that requires $96 oil just to break even on current spending and receives instead disrupted exports, repaired infrastructure that is restruck before it resumes operations, and drone production lines that distribute and multiply faster than the air defense units being deployed to stop them. Ukraine's weapon for this phase of the war is not a single missile or a single drone. It is a firestorm, a burning that moves across Russia's energy architecture the way a real fire moves across dry terrain, jumping between targets, resisting containment, finding the gaps in every defensive line. And the fires in Tuapse, in Primorsk, at Ust-Luga, in Novorossiysk, at Volgograd, at Kirishi, those are not separate events. They are one fire, one campaign, one sustained, methodical, relentlessly expanding application of Ukraine's most sophisticated strategic insight, that the way to make an army too expensive to sustain is to burn the treasury that funds it, not just the soldiers that fight it. Russia cannot put this out, not because Ukraine's drones are individually unbeatable, but because there are more of them than Russia's depleted air defense can reliably stop. Because Ukraine has spent 18 months punching holes in Russia's radar coverage and is now flying through them. Because the repeat strike doctrine ensures that repair does not equal recovery. Because the entire campaign is being run by a country that now produces more long-range attack drones in a month than the nation that launched the largest air offensive in Europe since World War II. Today, our deep strikes are no longer a sensation, Zelensky said. He was right. They are something more important than a sensation. They are a system. And systems, unlike sensations, do not burn out. The firestorm is still burning. It was burning yesterday. It will be burning tomorrow. And Russia, which owns the oil, controls the ports, has the air defense, and has the second largest military on the continent, has not found a way to put it out.